There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a country when it loses someone who felt like family, even to strangers. Turkey has known that silence more than once. Behind the glamour of Yeşilçam's golden reels and the modern glow of primetime television, there is a quieter history, one written not in box office numbers or magazine covers, but in hospital corridors, sudden phone calls, and the kind of grief that spreads through a nation before the sun even rises the next day. This is the story of 5 Turkish stars whose lives, in very different ways, ended before their audiences were ready to say goodbye. We begin not with an ending, but with a beginning, one that shaped everything Turkish cinema would come to look like for the next 30 years. In the spring of 1929, in the Izmir district of Konak, a boy named Ayhan Izian was born into a family of 6 children, descendants of immigrants from Thessaloniki. He lost his father when he was only 6 years old, and according to his own later writings, what he remembered most clearly about him was not his voice or his face, but the way he smelled and the warmth of being carried on his shoulders during a single fishing trip. It was a small memory to carry through an entire life, but it was one he never let go of. Money was scarce, and by the age of 12, the boy who would one day be called Turkey's crownless king was already working odd jobs to help support his mother and siblings. He found his way into art before he found his way into film, studying painting at the State Fine Arts Academy in Istanbul, where he joined a small collective of young painters who called themselves the 10. But it was a magazine contest, really almost an accident of fate, that pulled him toward the camera instead of the canvas. He won first place, and by 1951 he had made his film debut. What followed was one of the most extraordinary rises in Turkish entertainment history. By the early 1950s, under legendary director Ömer Lütfi Akat, he starred in Canon Namına, a film that didn't just make him famous, it helped define what a leading man in Turkish cinema could be. Audiences didn't just watch Ayhan Isaac. They fell in love with him, film after film, year after year. But what set him apart from the actors of his era wasn't only his face or his fame. It was something quieter, a sense of principle. At a time when actors in Turkey had almost no protections, Isaac became one of the loudest voices calling for unions, for insurance, for basic dignity in an industry that too often treated its performers as disposable. He had watched a colleague, actor Sufi Kaner, spiral into despair after being left without work by producers who simply moved on to someone else. That loss stayed with him, and it pushed him to fight, publicly, repeatedly, for the people around him, not just for himself. By the late 1970s, after nearly 140 films and nearly 3 decades in front of the camera, Ayhan Isaac seemed, to the outside world, untouchable. But on the morning of June 13, 1979, at his summer home in Selimpeza, he woke with a violent headache and began vomiting. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered a ruptured aneurysm causing a cerebral hemorrhage. Despite surgery, he slipped into a coma. For 3 days, the country waited. On June 16, 1979, at the age of 50, he was gone. The shock was immediate and enormous. Thousands gathered for his funeral at Sisli Mosque in Istanbul. His close friend and frequent co-star, a young actor named Sadri Alisic, was devastated, so much so that in the years that followed, he was known to write letters addressed to Isaac's grave, as if the conversation between them had simply been paused rather than ended. It's a detail that says more about the bond between Turkish performers of that era than any interview ever could. They weren't just colleagues. They were, in the truest sense, brothers in a profession that demanded everything from them. And it's here, through that friendship, that our story turns to Sadri Alisic himself, a man whose warmth on screen mirrored, by most accounts, the warmth he carried off it. Born Mehmet Sadrettin Alisic, he became, alongside Isaac, one of the defining faces of Turkish popular cinema. But where Isaac often played the elegant, principled leading man, Alisic carved out something different, a kind of everyman charm. His most beloved character, the bumbling, big-hearted tourist Ömer, became a cultural touchstone in Turkey, a role so associated with him that decades later, people would still greet him on the street using the character's name instead of his own. His films spoke to ordinary Turkish audiences because they were about ordinary people, poor, uneducated by the standards of the elite, but full of love, humor, and hope. That, more than any award, was his legacy while he was alive. Ilisic wasn't only an actor. He had a poet's sensitivity that he rarely got credit for during his most famous years, eventually publishing a collection of poems titled Bir Ömürlük İstanbul, Istanbul of a Lifetime. He was married to actress Gülpan İlhan, and by all accounts, theirs was one of the more enduring and admired partnerships in Turkish show business. But time, as it does with everyone, eventually caught up with him. On March 18, 1995, Sadri Ilisic passed away. He was laid to rest at Zincirlikuyu Cemetery in Istanbul, not far, fittingly, from where his old friend Ayhan Isaac had been buried 16 years earlier. After his death, his wife established a cultural center in his name, ensuring that tourist Ömer, and the man behind him, would never be fully forgotten by the country that had loved him. But grief, as much as it shapes memory, doesn't always announce itself in advance. Sometimes it arrives without warning, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, on the way to work that was never finished. That was the case with Kemal Sunal, a name that, even now, decades later, still makes Turkish audiences smile before they even remember why. If Ayhan Isaac represented elegance and Sadri Ilisic represented warmth, Kemal Sunal represented something else entirely. Pure, unfiltered comedy that spoke directly to the working class. His films, Habibam Sinefai, Sabin, Salako, Devaro, weren't critically fashionable, but they didn't need to be. They were beloved, watched and rewatched by generations of Turkish families, often characters who were poor, naive, endlessly good-hearted, and somehow always triumphant by the film's end. In 1977, he won the Golden Orange Award at the Antalya Film Festival, a rare moment of formal recognition for an actor whose real reward had always been the laughter of ordinary people in ordinary living rooms. On July 3, 2000, Kemal Sunal boarded a plane at Istanbul's Atatürk Airport, on his way to Trabzon for the filming of a new movie called Balalaika. He never made it off the ground. A sudden heart attack took his life right there, at the airport, before the flight had even departed. He was only 47 years old. The reaction across Turkey was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't just fans who mourned him. It was the country's leadership. President Ahmet Necdet Sezer, Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit, and the Minister of Culture all sent public messages of condolence, an extraordinary gesture for a comedic actor whose films were, on paper, simple entertainment. But that was exactly the point. Kemal Sunal hadn't just made people laugh. He had become part of the emotional fabric of Turkish daily life, and losing him felt, to millions, like losing someone from their own family. For years, it seemed like these kinds of losses, sudden, medical, unpredictable, belonged to a different era of Turkish cinema, one shaped by the pressures of Yeşilçam's relentless production schedules and the medical realities of earlier decades. But grief doesn't respect timelines. And more than 20 years after Kemal Sunal's death, Turkish audiences would be asked to say goodbye again, this time to a performer who had introduced Turkish television drama to millions of people far beyond the country's borders. His name was Ayberk Pekin, and to international audiences, he was known simply as Arctic Bey. Born in 1970, Pekin trained formally at Mersin University's Faculty of Fine Arts in the Department of Theater, a background that gave his performances a depth and restraint that stood out even in an industry full of talented actors. He built a long, respected career across Turkish television and film, appearing in acclaimed series like Yaprak Dokumu and Kurtlar Vadisi, and winning a Best Supporting Actor award at the Ankara International Film Festival for his role in the 2012 film Aşk ve Devrim. But it was his role as Arctic Bey, the wise, steady physician and advisor in Darilis, Ertugrul, that transformed him from a respected character actor into a genuinely global figure. The show became a phenomenon far beyond Turkey's borders, especially in Pakistan, where Pekin traveled in early 2020 as part of an official cultural delegation, greeted by crowds and government officials alike who had come to see, in the flesh, the actor whose voice and presence had become part of their own households. In October of 2021, Pekin shared devastating news with his fans directly, in a message posted to his own social media. What had started as a visit to the doctor for back pain, he explained, had led to a diagnosis of lung cancer, one that had already spread to his liver and adrenal glands by the time it was caught. He wrote with striking honesty about how the disease had shown no symptoms in its earlier stages, about beginning chemotherapy, and about leaning on his family and close friends for strength. He asked his fans, simply, to keep him in their thoughts. For months, he fought. But on January 24, 2022, in his hometown of Mersin, Ayberk Petkin passed away. He was 51 years old. The response from his Darilis, Ertugrul family was immediate and deeply personal. His co-star Esra Bilgic wrote that she had lost her dear brother, recalling how his guidance had shaped her as an actress. Engin Altan Dizayedin, who had played the show's lead character opposite him for years, posted a simple, heartfelt farewell. And in Pakistan, the country that had embraced him so warmly just 2 years earlier, grief poured out across social media, from ordinary fans to sitting politicians, all mourning a man many of them had never met in person but had, in a very real sense, invited into their homes every week for years. What makes Petkin's story different from the others is not the sadness of it. All of these stories carry sadness, but the way it illustrates something about modern fame in Turkey. His loss wasn't only felt at home. It was felt across borders, across languages, across a global audience that had grown through streaming and satellite television in ways that Ayhan Isaac or Kemal Sunal's generation could never have imagined. The mourning for Ayberk Petkin was, in its own way, proof of how far Turkish storytelling had traveled and how much it had come to mean to people who had never set foot in Turkey at all. And yet, even as the industry grew larger and more global, it never lost the particular cruelty of taking someone before their story had really begun. That brings us, finally, to a name far less known internationally, but one whose loss struck a very specific, very painful chord within Turkey itself, a chord that has nothing to do with age or illness, and everything to do with how sudden, how random, tragedy can be. Ibrahim Yildiz was only 27 years old. Still early in his career, he had already appeared in notable productions, including Duay Beni and the sprawling historical series Matizim Yüzyıl, Kozum, as well as Bir Zamanlar Kibris. He was, by most accounts, a young actor on the rise, the kind of performer whose biggest roles, whose defining moment, was presumably still ahead of him. On August 15, 2025, in the Kartal district of Istanbul, strong winds brought down a tree, and Yildiz was severely injured. He spent the following months in intensive care, fighting for his life in a battle that his colleagues followed closely and anxiously. His fellow actor, Caner Topçu, became the one who ultimately had to share the news that so many had been dreading. Ibrahim Yildiz did not survive. There is something particularly haunting about a story like his, precisely because it resists the narrative shape we expect from tragedy. There was no illness building slowly in the background, no long goodbye, no chance for the kind of final message that lets fans feel, at least, that someone was prepared. There was simply an ordinary day, a gust of wind, and then everything changed. For a young actor whose career was still being written, it was an ending that felt profoundly unfinished, and that, more than almost anything else, is what stayed with those who had been following his early work. Looking back across these 5 lives, a leading man of the 1950s, a beloved everyman of the same golden era, a comedic icon of the 1990s and 2000s, a global television star of the 2010s, and a young actor barely into his career in the 2020s. What becomes clear is that Turkish entertainment has never been protected from loss simply because it produces joy. If anything, the opposite seems true. The performers who gave the most laughter, the most warmth, the most escape to their audiences were, in the end, just as vulnerable as anyone else to a ruptured artery, a sudden heart attack, an aggressive illness, or a moment of terrible chance. But there is something else worth sitting with here, too. None of these men are remembered primarily for how they died. Ayhan Isaac is remembered as the man who fought for actors' rights before anyone else thought to. Sadri Alisic is remembered through a character so beloved that his name became a form of affectionate greeting. Kemal Sunal is remembered as the face that could make an entire nation laugh, regardless of politics or class. Ayberk Pekin is remembered as the quiet, steady presence who carried a piece of Turkish storytelling to households across the world. And Ibrahim Yildiz, though his career was cut short, is remembered by those who watched him as a young talent whose warmth was already visible on screen. Turkish audiences have shown, again and again, that they don't forget. Decades after Ayhan Isaac's death, tributes and documentaries still mark the anniversary of his passing. Sadri Alisik's cultural center still stands. Kemal Sunal's films are still played on television, still quoted in everyday conversation, more than 2 decades after his death. Ayberk Pekin's scenes as Arctic Bey are still watched by new viewers discovering Durailis, Ertugrul for the first time, completely unaware, until they look him up, that the actor behind the character is no longer alive to see how far his performance has traveled. That, in the end, might be the truest form of legacy available to any performer. Not the absence of an ending, because none of us are given that, but the simple fact that people keep watching, keep remembering, keep saying the name long after the cameras have stopped rolling. These 5 men left the stage far earlier than anyone wanted. But in the homes, the memories, and the ongoing conversations of Turkish audiences everywhere, in some very real sense, they never actually left at all.